Survivor Specialist John and McKenna are back to rewind this episode of 48, the premiere. In case you are new here, we take this episode of 48 and talk about Survivor's past moments that relate to what we have just seen. I am McKenna, this is John, and we are ready to get into it.
We are. And if you're watching, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. It really helps us all out. Phil will like you to do that. So we would too. But yeah, we're back with another season of the Rewind. And this is exciting because I don't think, and this is my just general impression of this 48 premiere, I don't feel like we have had a cast like this in the new era yet. This felt, me sitting there, I felt like this was such an old school vibe to this cast. And I don't know exactly what I mean by that, but maybe it's just like the return of some more blue collar workers into the cast and everything with the mix of some other things. But I don't know what it is. It feels old school, which hopefully means we're going to have plenty of things to discuss this season for the Rewind.
Yeah. So the way our structure is, we're going to do our Outwit, Outplay, and Outlast moments of the episode. Outwit being the strategy, Outplay being challenges, journeys, kind of things of that nature. And then Outlast being kind of just like a catch-all for maybe some more social moments or something to that effect. And yeah, you ready to dive into our Outwit segment?
I am. But first, I'm sure everyone wants to know, McKenna, how did you feel about the premiere for 48?
I enjoyed it. Was I blown away? I don't think so, but Survivor is back, so I am really excited. I think it's because I've been watching Australian Survivor with Phil that like the challenges are so big and booming, and like a bunch of things feel a bit more epic, that now coming back to regular Survivor, things don't feel as epic, but I know the majority of the people on the cast. So like there's give and take with these episodes. So having a lot more of these human moments between people was great. And I liked that aspect of it, but I'm a challenge girly and I just wish I got more.
I get that, especially with you covering Australian Survivor now. And us, it's awkward timing with this premiere coming after we've already watched 6 episodes of a new season of Australian Survivor, getting very accustomed to the challenges there where they literally torture their contestants. Going back to our typical, here's an obstacle course with a puzzle at the end challenges that we get in American Survivor. But overall, I agree. The human moments we get in this episode are fantastic. It's really fleshed out. The editing has gotten so much better as we've progressed through the new era. We have this better idea of the balance of everything. This is an episode that featured 21 confessionals for a single person. And it still didn't feel, at least to me, maybe I'm in the minority when I say this, I did not feel this episode was dominated by say whatsoever. I did not feel like we were ever being inundated by so much say that it was like, okay, we get it, say's here. I felt, and part of that probably comes from it being a 2-hour premiere. Part of it comes just from the pacing we get. But this is also one of those instances where sometimes in a 2-hour premiere, it can kind of start dragging a little bit. But I never felt like I was disengaged with this episode. Yeah. And I think a lot of that falls on this cast. I think this cast is wonderful. I think a lot of people came into this season with a lot of preconceived notions of how this cast was going to act, and seeing them on the beach interacting with each other has drastically altered that way of thinking for a lot of people.
Yeah, for sure. I am excited to see what they will do next.
Yeah, I there is so much potential brimming in this cast, and I'm so excited to see what they can possibly get up to, how all of these ideas, and they're taking like this formulaic approach to the new era where, 6 people on a tribe, build your alliance of 4. We see it on multiples of these tribes that's going on, but it doesn't feel like that's going to be the stick. Like, it doesn't feel like it's that stuck. Like, even coming out of the premiere where it seems like Mary is a clear bottom
Mhm.
on Vula, it doesn't feel like she's just dead in the water if they go back to tribal council. And I think that's going to be really interesting. And
Mhm.
I think that's really an indication of a good cast when it
Yeah,
doesn't feel like someone on the outs is completely out after one episode.
for sure. Yeah. Okay, so for Outwit, we are talking the strategic game versus the social game and how do you hit the beach, right? So we have, say, hitting the beach with the strategic game, being like, let's get alliances, alliances, alliances. Um, and she does not want the astrology, the stars that she gets opposed with. So, John, how would you navigate, the beat how what's the right way, the wrong way, the middle way?
I don't know. And like part of this is the fact that I haven't been on the beach playing Survivor. I think I would probably let the excitement get to me. I
Mhm,
would probably end up more in the say camp of things.
mhm.
However, is that the correct way to approach? No, I don't think so. I think history has shown us the say approach is a very dangerous approach to take in this game of Survivor. Most people who hit the beach running start over strategizing, start running around looking for idols and advantages immediately, don't end up lasting that long in the game most of the time.
Yeah, exactly, which is why I'm going to mention Zayn Knight and, Russell Swan here for our duo where Zayn throws himself under the bus for a strategy that he's like, "This is gonna work," and then is like, "JK, people still vote with me, and this is all part of my master plan," and it just blows up in his face. And Russell Swan is like being a bit more chilled out because the first time he played in Samoa, which is what we are watching over on the Patreon. So please check that out tomorrow. We are watching the premiere. So why don't you give that a watch and give us a listen? Um, he had that leadership thrust upon him, and so he was trying to take a bit more of a back seat in Philippines, and Zayn kind of just like overtook whatever strategy he could and just blew up. So this is what we've noticed when John and I were looking back at things is everything blows up on them. They're either the first boot, the second boot, that like it just doesn't they don't last.
Right, and a lot of that comes down to the conversation that Stephanie was having in this episode this week, where it's that idea of like, I just don't like say he's doing too much. There's so much going on. How do we approach that? How do you trust someone who's going around, running around, making alliances? And also doesn't help that probably doesn't help that say started talking to the girls was like, hey, what should we do? They didn't talk strategy, so she went and talked to the boys instead. Right?
Yeah.
Like that doesn't build a level of trust. And I think that part of that is the reason why we do see that conversation between Justin and Kevin in this episode of like, okay, do we keep Say or do we take out Stephanie here? Like we know where the idol is, but we could also just get rid of the idol right now.
Mhm, and
And
then
I
we
think
could find it maybe.
that's a very interesting aspect of it. And I'm very intrigued to see how Say navigates this moving forward because, like you said, historically, people who overplay, it blows up in their face really early. Look at
Mhm,
someone like Zayn that you've mentioned, right? Who hits the beach running, is already in this like frantic state because he just quit smoking
mhm.
and is out there trying to deal with that withdrawal, but also feels like he's going to over strategize. Feels like it's a good idea to say, hey, vote me out because that way people won't vote him out. Despite the fact that we've discussed on this podcast many times.
It's like trying to dupe Russell into thinking that he's quitting, but actually behind the scenes, wink, wink, I have an army.
Yeah. And like we've discussed on this podcast and on several podcasts several times, the first vote's the hardest vote in Survivor because it's like almost all vibes based. And saying, hey, just vote me out makes it really easy for people just to write your name down.
Mhm.
And like we contrast that with Russell Swan, who, granted, is coming on with experience, understands how the game's going, had, obviously a life and death situation in Samoa, and is approaching the game, trying to approach the game from a more like laid back position rather than being that upfront leader that he was in Samoa.
Yeah.
Fails to do that. However, has the intention of doing that and isn't as prominent in that first episode of Philippines as someone like Zane is, who's just running all over the place. We look at some of the other examples we have of this. We have David Sampson and Garrett Adelstein in Kagayan. I think both of them kind of like hit the ground running. They kind of do it in different ways where David immediately decides that Garrett is the weakest person because he thinks it's strategic to do that and sends Garrett off at the beginning. And then Garrett, pressures the camp to like buddy system up and sit at camp for that boat where he goes home. You have Tony in Game Changers, who's just like out there running out looking for idols. And it's just like, what are you doing?
Yeah,
this
exactly.
is the thing. It's like this mentality. And that's why I think this episode works so well, is because there are very few people I think you can talk to who were 100% convinced Say was safe at the end of that episode.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I also think it's interesting because like Say is approaching this, I think a little bit more old school of I'm going to show my alliance the idol to gain favor with them. I mean, it is because she can't solve the puzzle, but I think that's due to it. She trusts these people, so it's enough of she can't solve this puzzle on her own that she's going to show these people. She's going to tell them all the letters to help her unlock it. So there are old school ways that she's, I guess, forming this alliance that makes it feel a little bit more genuine.
Yeah, I think that's really the best way to put it. It does have these old school vibes, and maybe that's part of the reason why this cast feels old school, is because they're almost approaching it in a more old school manner, where it's a little more upfront with information. We talked so much about how, and obviously, like Sandra, when she plays Blood versus Water in Australia, says never tell anyone when you have an idol and things like that. And I think there's a large facet of the Survivor community who like adheres to that, like this idea of like don't share advantages. It's a mistake to do that. But there are strategic advantages to doing so.
Yeah.
And what we see Say doing here is, yes, could Say probably never have figured this out without it? No, I mean, enough time. But
she wanted to have her vote.
Don't lose your vote because the vote's currency. And Say expresses that, right? Like knows it's currency. Is able to leverage the fact that, okay, I've lost my vote, but now I have this. And we do get the confirmation bias of Say didn't go home right away, despite telling everyone that she has the idol. And it's very interesting when we contrast that to something like Australian Survivor, where we had someone show them get the idol right away and like flaunt it rather than bringing people in, right? We have these contrasts going on right now. It's interesting. It's old school. It's not something that I would do, but maybe this is the way to approach hitting the beach hard. Maybe hitting the beach hard isn't about running off and finding idols like we often equate it to, and maybe it is about building relationships, and that's where you get the longevity.
You know who hits the beach hard and builds relationships, John?
I do, and I don't know if you all want to hear this, but if we're looking at people who hit the beach hard and have that longevity in the game, there's really just one answer, and it's Russell Hantz.
We tried to avoid talking about this, dear listeners, but we have to do it. We are not saying that Say is like Russell in personality. Please, we are drawing the line. But just his, all right, gotta form the alliances, gotta get these girls on my side. And Say is like, all right, I'm gonna try get these girls on my side. Nope, gonna get the boys on my side. And just really like grinds, and Russell is also grinding this first episode to establish lines.
Yeah, and that's the interesting thing. And because we talked about it earlier, where in this new era where you have a 6-person tribe, getting your 4 super important because that helps drive everything. 4 is what gives you the majority. It keeps you safe for 2 votes, which theoretically should be enough to get you to the merge in the new era. When we see Say doing it, like, I think the real comparison between the way Say approached the game here and Russell approached the game here, and it's going to be very fascinating as the season progresses to see how Say manages these relationships and how she approaches them and reflects on them post game. Because, again, these relationships don't feel anything like Russell's relationships, but it's this checkpoint method of approaching the game right away, where it's like Russell hits the beach and he's like, I'm going to make individual alliances with all of these women.
Yeah.
That's how I'm going to approach the game. Whereas, Say tries to make
everything
this
group.
Yeah, like, tries to make this group, and he's like, nope, I'm going to do this group because you're not, like, biting, so I'm going to go over here. And it's that checkpoint, and it's like, okay, got my group of 3. I have my 3, and we have this one other guy coming back to camp. We'll loop him in. Sick. We've got this now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I think they both approach it differently via, like, groupings versus pairings. But I'm interested to see, since 2 of the guys were already maybe trying to flip on her, if next episode she doesn't play the idol and they flip on her and Mary gets saved.
I don't know. It could really go either way. There was a lot of
If
conversation.
they lose.
If they lose. I know, well, I mean, looking at this tribe, I mean, it's hard when out of 3 tribes, the purple tribe looks like they're just going to dominate everything, because that is
good. I don't want people to go from the purple.
But Phil and Will were mentioning it on Digging Deeper yesterday, just like the idea that flipping also means flipping on Cedric here. Mm-hmm. So, like, I think that is a question the boys need to ask of where they want to go. But that wasn't the case with Russell. Russell immediately flips on one of his alliances because he gets wind that she's a little cautious of him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, enough about Russell Hands. We are going to go to Outplay, and we have an odd Outplay this time around because normally we'd get fishing gear as our reward here. Fishing gear is always the next reward after Flint.
Most of the time. I think it's very rarely an instance where it's not. Except for, like, season, and I'm not counting seasons where there's nowhere to fish.
Right. And here is one of those rare occasions where it's like the toolkit, shelter, like, kind of supplies situation. And typically that comes, like, a bit later, or it's part of a challenge in old school.
Yeah, it's really interesting because we haven't seen toolkits, and now that might just be because they're not showing us that toolkits are prevalent in the new era. It almost feels contradictory to the way they're trying to sell the new era to us.
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like, the new era is harder. We're not giving them rice. We're making them work for it. But here, have a hammer and some nails, and use all this, like, clearly pre-cut and imported bamboo that we have on your beaches to build a nice shelter to keep you going. It makes me wonder, because if we look historically, the seasons that kind of feature these toolkits is the word that we are using. They tend to be heavier rain seasons, and as we were planning this podcast, McKenna, you may have mentioned that we never see rain on Survivor anymore. And
yeah, it's very, very rare.
So I wonder if they were anticipating heavier rains this season for when they were filming 48, but I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it goes. But I mean, if we go back to, like, the old school one, I think the one I think that really sticks out to everyone, and like you said, the old school challenges, it's All Stars. It's got to be the All Stars challenge where they're building shelters, right? And we see the vast difference between Rupert's shelter building skills and Boston Rob's shelter building skills.
Yeah, I mean, let's just dig a hole, right?
Yeah, that's the best way to do it. The tide's not a thing we have to worry about ever.
No. Yeah. So this challenge is iconic, and we get something similar in Palau, where we have to build a bathroom. And so like these are where people can pick certain toolkits. We have, I think, Craftsman sponsor something in Heroes versus Villains. So like they're getting these like toolkits and things like that through a challenge, but surprise, you get to keep it.
Yeah, which is very different from the way they're approaching this. And what's interesting is that we don't see the use of the toolkit at all
Mm-mm.
in this episode. So it'll be interesting to see if it pops up next week and if there is any implications of it, because it's weird to introduce. I know it's not terribly weird because there are a lot of rewards we get that we don't actually see them like using all the time. I think one would be like comfort, where they get the tarp. We don't see them talking about the tarp all the time,
Yeah.
unless of course there's an idol hidden in it. Or even like the hammock, right? When they win the hammock through comfort, and like we see
Mhm.
them in the hammock, but we kind of forget that it was this reward that they received, or the pillows and blankets that they kind of get.
Yeah,
But the toolkit is one that like drastically changes your approach to building a shelter.
for sure. And like, in Redemption Island, they just were given it. It was just like on the beach.
Yeah, I think there are a couple reasons for that, because
Boston
obviously
Rob is a carpenter.
Boston Rob's there and is a carpenter, and again, we literally just talked about him building a shelter in season
Also,
8.
yeah.
So yeah, we'll give him that. But I think it's also because they were still filming in Nicaragua,
Mhm.
and of course, Nicaragua had 2 people quit off the backs of like how bad the weather was.
Mhm.
So I think that really plays into it a bit.
And then in a newer season, well, newer 10 seasons ago, Game Changers, they had the ability to do like a second chance thing with the rice. They could swim out to a buoy and go get their new fancy shiny toolkit. And that's again right off the bat of we can build a nice shelter.
Yeah, McKenna, first I have to break it to you. That was actually 14 seasons ago,
Well, I know it
but
was I
but
didn't want to do the
alas,
exact math, but
but alas, you're right, and it is. But that's something we missed from not having a marooning anymore, though, right?
mhm,
Because we don't have a marooning, so there isn't the hey,
do the
work,
thing.
go do the thing, try to get this, and I think it was really interesting in Game Changers because it was kind of that decision of hey, are we going to beat Aussie at this?
No.
So like, why try?
Yeah.
And that's the interesting fact about it. But I don't think it's a coincidence that the seasons we have mentioned have been returning player seasons,
That's true.
right? I think there's a reason that's there. I
Hey.
think it's
Oh, wait, shit. Oh,
what
no, it's not there returning. So, I mentioned Palau. There
you
we
did,
go.
you did. But I'm saying I think it's pretty. I don't think it's a coincidence that we see these come in returning player seasons. I think it is very
Yeah.
intentional by production to include those in returning player seasons,
Mhm.
which is also what makes it such an outlier that it's the first reward that we see here, especially when you take into consideration there was a tribe that doesn't have supplies at all.
Right.
And that supplies includes the machete.
Mhm. Yeah, so I like the toolkit here, but it's also, it is interesting when you think about New Era and not wanting to give them food, not giving them fishing gear right off the bat is, again, a way of not giving them food.
Yeah, it's such a tough call, and I think we are moving away from this new era idea of okay, we are going to make them starve all the time.
Mhm.
I think part of that is like we're ramping up to 50. That's going to be a very different season. I feel, um, depending how voting goes. If you haven't voted already, make sure you go vote. You can vote between rice and no rice. Those options are there, but I think I don't. They're not pressing it anymore. They're not talking about it anymore. Right? There's no. When
Mhm.
was the last time the monster was mentioned? 42?
No, we had a few seasons
Was
after
it?
40, yeah,
I have to
100%.
revisit the new era. I'm not gonna lie. I haven't rewatched any of the new era seasons yet, but there's they aren't pushing this idea of like the survival. It almost feels like we're in the same trajectory we had when we started the show, where it's like, yeah, it's all about survival. They're surviving.
Mm.
And now it's like, but we also have this really great game that's actually at the center of the show.
Yeah. All right, moving on to our Outlast moments of the week. We are going with responses to vulnerability. So we have Eva and Joe with this beautiful segment that, like, bless the editors that this was in the episode and not a secret scene. And we get Joe's response to Eva being like, well, now she's got me. I'm with her 100%. So these are things, there's some other moments here that we want to talk about that are similar reactions to what happened here.
Yeah, I don't even know if similar is the best way to put it, because it feels more like an evolution of the
Right. Yeah.
I think one of the things we talk about Survivor being like this microcosm of society. And one thing you can really trace as we progress through the years with Survivor is we can actually see like this evolution of society and how we approach certain topics.
Mhm.
And that was what was so nice about this Eva and Joe segment. And McKenna, be real with me. Be real with everyone listening and watching. Did you cry?
I didn't.
Wow, I cried. I was crying like a baby. It was so touching.
I cried. I almost cried because I remembered Joe lost his sister, and his sister was a Survivor fan, so I was crying when he got the news that he was
Right.
gonna be on Survivor.
At the
And I
beginning of
was
the
just
episode.
like, yeah, at the beginning of the
Okay.
episode, and I was just like, "No, must not."
Yeah. Well, I
So I
definitely
was
got
like, it was definitely emotional, and sometimes it just, like, takes too much effort for me to cry that I don't wanna do it, and so I'm just like, "No, you're not doing it."
I was definitely tearing up throughout
Yeah,
it, and then Joe says, "I've got her," and I'm like, "Oh no, I'm done.
yeah.
There's no way I'm not. I'm no dry eyes anymore. This is done."
Mhm.
Uh, but it's such a touching moment, and it's such a genuine moment, which is
And
so
such not
nice
an
to see.
old school, new era, thing either.
Where they're like highlighting it, and they're like,
Well, no, like, "I've got her, I will lay down my life in the game for her."
"Oh, I see. You're just talking about like the relationship itself, how it has like
Yeah,
that old school like Roger and Elizabeth type of
right,
vibe to it."
exactly. Like,
Yeah,
that's not a thing. It's like, how can I now use this information and take advantage of her like what Eva was worried about?
yeah, yeah.
But
And on top of that, it's not. Well, I think one of the big criticisms we've had of the new era in general is like the like sob story narrative
mhm,
of we're going to frame things so that it elicits an emotional response, and
mhm.
it's based on flashbacks or confessionals with like photo montages and stuff like that. This was something that actually happened on the island, which felt so different
Yeah,
than
yeah.
that, and and I think that helped with the genuine
Mhm,
aspect of it. But it's also just the human response to it and the very protective nature that Joe takes of the situation.
mhm. Yeah,
Um, and I think we'd be pretty remiss not to contrast it to another moment that was shown in this episode when we go all the way back to Survivor Amazon,
mhm.
where we have Christy is there and she's revealing to the tribe that she's deaf, and she's outlining, what needs to be done in order to help accommodate that and integrate her into the tribe. And as that season progresses, the women kind of like struggle with doing that.
Mhm.
And we don't get it's not a one-on-one conversation. Obviously, Christy needs to be a little more forward with this in the systems because it is literally a communication thing and something that it's like, oh, hey, if I'm not facing you, I might not know you're talking to me.
Yeah.
But there's almost this ostracization which happens there. And I think that's part of what Eva feared, right?
Mhm,
As someone who's watched Survivor and going out there, there's still that different aspect of it, right? That idea of like I'm different, so they're going to treat me different than they treat everyone else. And I think that's the beauty of this scene that we received this
mhm,
week is it shows this evolution of and it's not a one for one comparison because it's not the same thing. It's not the exact same situation. It's a group setting versus an individual setting. But we're still dealing with how people respond to this,
Yeah.
right? And I think that's the beauty of it and how it shows this evolution of society as a whole, where
Mhm.
we are working more to accommodate people now. Where and there are moments in Amazon where we do see people accommodate, like after the swap, where the guys are like, okay, we're going to turn the lantern up lighter so that Christy can kind of like see what's going on more and read our lips better.
Mhm.
But we don't get that from the woman at the start of that season. And I think like that's so interesting to just investigate now, 20 years later.
Yeah, exactly. Um, I wanna talk about Natalie Anderson and Jeremy because Natalie, in a very public setting, is like, "Oh, you guys voted out Nadia, like, I haven't been apart from her my entire life, like, this is gonna be rough for me." And then Jeremy loses Val, and we know how much Val means to Jeremy. We learned that in the first few minutes with the challenge and exile.
Mhm.
So those two people lost their absolute rocks and they formed a bond with mutual vulnerability because Jeremy has expressed his vulnerability, Natalie expressed hers, and they formed this amazing duo together that were like rock solid ride or die. And that's
Yeah.
interesting because it was, like, for f formed from, like, outside things happening in the game, like, outside game aspects pushing them together. They were already starting to align, but, like, it really, I think, forged them forward.
Yeah, and that situation is very interesting because you get people in similar situations, and that's again the contrast that we have with this Ava Joe situation, where Joe doesn't know exactly
Mhm.
what this means for Ava. However, we had that confessional where he's talking about, I was just thinking about like what would I do if my daughter, like if my
Mhm.
daughter was saying that to me, and how would I approach it?
Right.
And I think it's that type of empathy that really relates to this Natalie and Jeremy situation, where Natalie, of course, has been on 2 reality shows with her sister at this point. This is the first time she's been on a reality. It's probably hyperbolic for her to say that she had never been without her sister before that moment,
Yeah,
but it
for,
it
like, for longer than a week or something like
yeah,
that, he said.
but this is literally the first time in her reality TV career where she has been without her sister.
Mhm.
And that's a big thing to become accustomed to after already being in that sphere and already
Yeah.
having that experience. So when Jeremy also loses Val and that bond that's created from that loss, which is something that can connect people so well. And we
Mhm.
see it often in Survivor that people can bond over loss. This is something that makes sense in Survivor, and it really only works in this blood versus water situation where you can actually equate it one on one. And
Yeah.
it's not like, oh man, I lost my closest person on this tribe too, in like a tribe
Yeah,
swap
right,
situation,
right.
right?
So, yeah, these are really like interesting ways where people are vulnerable. And another one that we were toying around with was in Heroes, Healers, Hustlers, where Chrissy is like wiped out after the challenge and is vulnerable in front of everybody because she's really like unwell. And then Ryan gives her the safety, and then they meet up at the swap and are like, I helped you in your time of need, and you did. Oh my gosh, like, thank you so much." And that just, like, solidified them to the end.
Yeah, it's that vulnerability. It's that like we said, like this entire segment is based on this response to vulnerability because there are people who can abuse vulnerability. People
Mhm.
who like those people that Evil was scared of, right? The people who, if she says, "Hey, I can't really tell when someone's lying to me," who will be like, "Great, I'm going to lie to you the entire game."
Yeah, exactly.
And luckily, we don't have people like that in New Era Survivor.
Mhm.
People who will take advantage, right? Like we have people who will game, who will play the game hard. We don't have people who are going to take advantage of people. I think that is what Jeff meant when a couple seasons ago he said we're not casting villains anymore.
Right.
Those are the people they're not casting.
Mhm.
Whereas you have people who are going to respond the way Joe does now, where he's going to be understanding, and it's like, I don't need to understand it. You are telling me what I need to do. That's what I'll do.
Right.
And I will
Exactly.
hold you in. And that vulnerability, sharing that vulnerability with me has
Mhm.
bonded me so closely with you that we are going to work lock and step throughout this entire game.
Yeah, I'm excited to see how their relationship progresses. And that's the show, everyone. So make sure you watch the Samoa premiere and catch us over on the Patreon tomorrow. John, what else do we have going on this week?
Whoa, McKenna, a lot. We have a lot going on. Turns out we have so much content right now. We are at this moment in reality TV, the schedule, where everything aligns, everything's lined up. The only thing we don't have right now is Big Brother, essentially. We have The Traders still has one more episode left. We have Dondi, Deal or No Deal Island still going. We have Australian Survivor. We have everything. So every week you can catch Phil, and this week it was Blake. Most of the time it'll be Will doing that weekly recap. Make sure you check that out if you haven't. Digging Deeper on Thursdays. Phil and Blake usually do that. Will's there because Blake was on the recap this year. This week. You have us on Fridays doing this. Phil this week will be joined. Come on. If there was any question of who our first guest from Survivor 47 was going to be, we all knew it was going to be Rome. He will be joining Phil at noon Eastern on Sunday for the predictions and power rankings. That should be a very, very fun podcast. McKenna, you guys are doing Australia Brains vs. Bronze 2 every Tuesday.
Hell yeah.
Deal or No Deal Island coverage is on Wednesdays. Traders recap is after the episode on Thursday. So you'll get that much needed finale recap right after that episode next week. And then we have the Patreon. The Patreon has even more. There's Every Season Matters. There's $5 Tuesdays where Phil and I talk about movies. Oh, wait, that's also a main channel show where Phil and I talk about movies. We've just done, we do our top 10s. We just did our Oscar predictions. It's March, like tomorrow. So we got a bracket coming up. We're doing plot twists. So that should be a really fun one to
imagine plot twists. You're not actually doing plot twists.
Oh man, Phil might do that to me, and I really hope that's not the case. There's the Survivor Rock Draw on the Patreon. There's Every Season Matters, where they're talking about fans' favorites right now.
I think so, yeah.
I think McKenna and Phil are talking Australia, the Survivor Brains vs. Bronze 1 over on the Patreon, and of course, there's us over on the Patreon too. The Q&A, Phil's after show. There's so much there. And most importantly, for our $20 patrons, the power rankings start next week. You still have time to get in as a $20 patron and sign up for the power rankings. So you're all good. The other games have unfortunately closed at this point, but there's so much going on this season. Thank you for tuning in. We're so excited to keep talking about Survivor with you. Tune in next week. Should be around the same time. And like the video, subscribe to the channel. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time.